One of the most daring and difficult engineering feats ever completed cost the lives of over 25,000 workers and helped America take the position as one of the world's foremost powers. The Panama Canal was a project nearly 400 years in the making, and after other nations failed attempts, America, largely under the command of President Roosevelt, completed what seemed to be an impossible task to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through Central America. But why was this project so important to Roosevelt and so many Americans that it would be worth such a frightful cost? And how did it advance America's status in the world? Well, that's just the treasure that we're out to discover. I'm Dan Luer, and this is History for Humans. What do you make of this political cartoon? What's it saying about Roosevelt and his involvement in the construction of the canal? Not quite flattering nor entirely accurate. For one, TR was not quite that large outside of his own ego, but it does reveal a lot about the central role TR will play in this amazing triumph that is interwoven with conquest, intrigue, and conspiracy, and a hell of a lot of dynamite. Do notice the warships that are gathered at the isthmus, the sign supporting a new treaty. We're going to be making sense of this cartoon and learning the story behind it today. You see, Roosevelt took it as one of his most important goals as president to see that America led the construction of the canal, to shortcut the incredibly long and dangerous journey by thousands of miles around South America. And though he actually didn't shovel any dirt himself, he did do everything he could to see to it that he helped lead America to empire and naval supremacy in the world. But before we go any further, our exploration question for today is, why was the building of the Panama Canal such an important goal for Roosevelt, and what does it reveal about America's new role in the world? So let's see how well you can muster an answer to that by the end of this story lecture. But we got some history to shovel. Dig it? Let's go. So where we left off last episode, it was 1898. America defeated Spain and claimed colonial possessions for the first time in its history. It also snagged up and annexed Hawaii along the way, an essentially strategic location smack in the middle of the Pacific. But destiny was not written in stone. It came down, like all history does, to decisions and actions made by individuals, and it was now time for McKinley and Americans across the map to decide what to do with the territories they acquired, set them free or take them as colonies and territorial possessions. But Americans were divided, as was McKinley. A bill to grant the Philippines independence was actually just one vote shy of passing. And as for McKinley, he was eventually convinced that the Filipinos were not ready or even capable of self-government, and that they needed the support and guidance and governance of America, even if it was against their wishes, which it was. And though it's easy to mock that sentiment today and rightly criticize it for its flagrant racism, it was true that when most nations were thrust into liberty and democracy after revolution, many divulged first into chaos and then into tyranny. So McKinley's concerns were not entirely unfounded, nor were his concerns that other imperial powers would swoop in and take the Philippines for themselves. But the Filipino people fought back fiercely for their independence against America, under a man who would later become a national hero, Emilio Aguinaldo. The guerrilla war against the Filipinos would prove to be much more challenging than simply defeating the Spanish forces there, revealing how close to their hearts their desire for independence and freedom was. But eventually they were subdued and became an American territory for nearly 50 years.
Yes, Americans were fighting and dying to liberate Cuba from Spain, and now they're fighting and dying to subjugate the Philippines? That didn't take long for them to turn into the thing they were supposedly morally against. Yeah.
Indeed, Mahina. History is complicated, and American history is full of contradictions and hypocrisy. There were certainly people who hoped to profit from this venture, and certainly ones hoping to do good by it. So it's a complicated tale, which makes history challenging, but also so darn interesting.
Challenging. I could find a different word for it.
Still yet, some Americans agreed with you, Mahina, and fought hard against this move to empire. Some prominent leaders and thinkers, including Mark Twain and Andrew Carnegie, formed the Anti-Imperialist League. They argued it went against American principles found in, what's that document, kind of a big deal for Americans, kind of like a badge of pride? Oh yeah, the Declaration of Independence. The philosopher William James said America was about to puke up its heritage if they became colonizers like the European powers. However, their arguments just simply lost out for those who were advocating empire. The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, a book written by Alfred Mahan, convinced many Americans of the need to become a global power by strengthening their navy, and this book became gospel to men like Theodore Roosevelt. And this belief was also leading the French to race to build a canal to strengthen their navy and their ability to police their global empire, but they were finding only death and disaster in Panama's dense jungle. The dream of the Panama Canal dates back to the early 1500s with King Charles I of Spain, when they were first colonizing the New World. But the prospects of digging a canal through the narrowest isthmus in Central America was just not practical nor really possible in the 16th century. But industrialization changed that, and in the 19th century, France put forth the first real effort to build a canal, and they took it as a national challenge to accomplish this. The French got to work in Panama shortly after the Suez Canal was built, connecting the Mediterranean with the Red Sea. And the very man who oversaw and led the engineering work in Egypt, Count Ferdinand de Lesseps, would oversee this project as well. The French worked out a treaty for access to the canal area located in Panama, which was still a part of Colombia at the time, and threw everything they had at the canal's construction. But the challenges that de Lesseps faced in Egypt were nothing like what he confronted in Panama. The incessant rains led to massive landslides as they tried to excavate the mountainous terrain, wiping out progress and men along the way. The thick jungle was unruly, and there was a lack of infrastructure to move in and out supplies. And worst of all, tropical diseases, namely malaria and yellow fever, that killed thousands upon thousands of their workers. As news spread, despite their efforts to censor the information, it was incredibly hard to replace those workers with the general French proclivity to eat baguettes and make jazz and not die in the sweltering jungle. They began construction in 1881, but made little progress in 8 years. And with the high cost of the construction, the project was bankrupt. And France threw in the towel after spending nearly $300 million and losing 22,000 workers to disease. But the failure of the French seemed only to motivate many Americans who were hungry to put their stamp on the world as the leading industrial and engineering power. And no one was more enthusiastic than President Roosevelt, who was already flexing America's military muscle around Latin America. So America began negotiating a treaty to build the canal, and it passed through the Senate quickly, but was suddenly rejected by the Colombian government, much to Roosevelt's ire and fury. Shortly thereafter, rebels in Panama were fighting for freedom from the Colombians. And as the rebellion began, the American Navy was on the scene at the perfect time and blocked any Colombian assault on the Panamanians. Recall our anchor image and the gunboats at Roosevelt's feet, the new treaty sign, and Roosevelt dumping dirt on Bogota, the capital of Colombia. And more of it should be making sense. The Republic of Panama then declared independence, and America was the first nation to acknowledge the new country. And just weeks after gaining independence, wouldn't you know it, a new treaty was signed, granting America control of the canal zone.
The people of Panama love Roosevelt while the Colombians hated him. One loving him, the next minute I'm hating him. Like those people who were caught in the middle of that civil war.
Well, I'm glad that history is resonating with you, Kolohe. It is possible to admire certain parts of Roosevelt and then criticize others. And the Panamanians felt likewise. They were surely grateful for military support in Roosevelt and America's Navy. Many felt that the treaty for the canal zone gave away precious resources that they had just fought for. And it was there in Panama that provided the clearest example of Roosevelt's foreign policy, dubbed the Big Stick, after an African proverb that he loved that said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick. You will go far." And indeed, Roosevelt's Big Stick was getting plenty of at-bats across Latin America and forever changing America's position in the world. If McKinley was a reluctant imperialist, Roosevelt was a proud and adamant one, who believed America's new role as a world power and its colonial possessions was not just beneficial for America, but for the world as well. And it is true that in American territories, a lot of effort and money went towards noble ends. In places like Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines and Guam, American engineers and money built and improved infrastructure, schools and public education, and miracles in public health that saved countless lives. But surely America benefited more, with access to new resources and markets and increased position in the world. And none of this changed the fact that those countries were being ruled against their will, despite whatever benefits they were getting. He came into the presidency. He wanted to send a message to Europeans that the US would not tolerate their interference in any country in the Western Hemisphere. Now, this had actually been policy since 1820 with the Monroe Doctrine, but the problem was the US didn't really have the means to enforce it, so it was violated frequently. But things had changed by the time Roosevelt came into office, and he was ready to let others know it. And he announced the Roosevelt Corollary that pretty much stated any chronic wrongdoings by a Latin American nation would require the intervention by the United States, who had a right to assume the role of an international police force. This was the Monroe Doctrine 2.0, updated slated for the new century. So when Santo Domingo failed repeatedly to pay its debts to Germany, Britain, and others, and as those nations were ready to intervene, Roosevelt beat them to the punch. The American military took control of the custom houses to manage the payments and other affairs of the Dominican Republic. Roosevelt stated, "I have been hoping and praying for 3 months that the Santo Domingans would behave so that I would not have to act in any way. I want to do nothing but what a policeman has to do. As for annexing the island, I have about the same desire to annex it as a gorged boa constrictor might have to swallow a porcupine, wrong and two." And although the island was not annexed, this was the first swing of the big stick, but it wouldn't be the last. Between 1898 and the present, America has intervened dozens of times into the affairs of Latin America under many presidents, and much of it stems from the principle that Roosevelt set with his corollary, that America has a right and a duty to act as a policeman in the Caribbean Sea. And there was nowhere he brandished the big stick like in Panama, as American engineers were quickly running into massive problems of their own as they tried to do what the French could not. The man that Roosevelt put in charge of the canal's construction was a railroad engineer named John Wallace. Unlike the early efforts of the French, Wallace realized that a sea-level canal would not work because of the rampant landslides that made it nearly impossible to blast your way through the country. Instead, a lock canal would be constructed that built up cement supports, which could be flooded with water to carry the ships through. But his men too were falling from diseases, and construction was moving at a snail's pace. Roosevelt's hand-picked man then resigned, leaving Roosevelt worried about the possibilities of completing it. But his resignation was a blessing in disguise. Lieutenant Colonel George Washington Goethals became the new chief engineer, and maybe more importantly, Colonel William C. Gorgas was hired to manage public health and battle against the diseases plaguing the workforce and the people of Panama. It was only recently learned that mosquitoes were the major carriers of tropical diseases, and Gorgas went to war against those buzzing tyrants. From simple fixes like putting screens on windows of homes and workplaces to spraying quite toxic chemicals to kill larvae in water around the canal zone, and massive draining of stagnant waters. Through his efforts, yellow fever was totally eradicated by 1905, and within the decade, malaria was as well. When America took over the canal zone, the machinery they had purchased from the French was dilapidated and in disrepair, so American manufacturers went to work to build massive machines to do the heavy lifting required for the project. New railroads in Panama were constructed to move out the millions of pounds of earth that were dug and dynamited out from the mountains and the jungle. Under Goethals, American and other hired workers from the Caribbean constructed what became the world's largest man-made lake at the time towards the center of the isthmus, with the world's largest dam and massive irrigation projects throughout the canal zone. To oversee what he believed would serve as one of his ultimate achievements and legacies, Roosevelt took a trip down to Panama to oversee the construction of the project and grab a great photo op in the process, here sitting at a massive mechanical steam-powered shovel in a dazzling white suit just like ones you would wear if you were digging canals through the jungle. This was the first time an American president traveled abroad while in office. But Roosevelt was not the president when the canal was completed. It was President Wilson in 1914 that sent a telegram to the canal zone that triggered the final explosion, allowing water from a dam to flood into the locks, and the canal was finally complete. It was a dream 400 years in the making, the ambition of many imperial powers, and after 10 years of American construction, canal crossed the continent and connected the Atlantic and Pacific. It was the most expensive engineering project in American history at the time and costs over 5,500 lives, about 10% of the workforce during the American part of the construction. But when you add that to the 22,000 that died under French construction, it puts the total closer to 30,000. The Panama Canal, though, greatly expedited, accelerated, and expanded global trade. It helped America's new Navy better control its growing global empire and demonstrated to the world that there was a new formidable power on the block, one that would play an essential role in the Great War that broke out almost exactly when the canal was first put into operation in August of 1914. The outbreak of World War I put a damper on the grand ceremony that America had planned of the first ship passing through the canal, but its place in history could not and would not be denied. The canal is considered one of the 7 modern wonders of the world, and it's an unbelievable American achievement, up there with the moon landing and the iPhone. And in 1974, reflecting some American remorse over the wrongdoings of the past, President Carter signed a treaty that gave control over the canal back to Panama that went into into effect in 1999, something I'm sure Mr. Roosevelt would have had a soft word or a big stick to say about. And Roosevelt's big stick and canal project put America into a greater position than anyone into stepping into the role that America still fills today, that of the global power and global policeman in many ways. But what role America will play in the world of tomorrow will be decided by a new generation of leaders, individuals, and citizens like you. And until then, thanks for engaging in history today. This has been History for Humans. And if you like what we do here, it would be great if you clicked and showed it and hit the bell and the whistle and all that other stuff. But also head over to our website where we have forums for you to jump into conversations with students from across the country. And if you're doing the learning activity, hang out because we've got quick instructions in just a second. So you can recall the territories America gained from the war, understand the Roosevelt corollary, but can you map it? It's time to join your historian's hat with that of a geographer's. On the map, you're first going to label America, the territories it had gained by 1900, locate the area on the Roosevelt corollary, and then mark the Panama Canal. And don't forget the key. It's pretty key. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, and then for part 2, you're going to get back on that historian's hat, and you're going to be reading 3 short but incredibly juicy primary sources. You're going to identify if they're supportive or critical of American imperialism, and then the next box, you're going to identify their main arguments, put it in your own words so it's clear that you understand it, and then sum up their argument in less than 8 words. You're going to make a short but powerful argument whether you think Americans were motivated more by moral or for selfish reasons to interfere and to annex other countries. So state your claim, give evidence, and then explain your reasoning. Do your best, rock it, guys. Enjoy swimming in this history. I'll catch you next time.